This is the Sacred Knowing of Is, Book 2, Part 1, written by Tisziji Muñoz, video series number 3. I had some questions regarding chapters 43 through 49 that I'd like to ask you. From chapter 43, you write, all beings who have the karmic ability and necessity can develop or cultivate the relative powers of genius through creative techniques or spiritual exercises which impress and release the inner or subtle powers of spirit. My question is, could you give specific examples of some creative techniques or spiritual exercises that a beginner practitioner could do to tap into these powers?
The first thing would be to be open to developing more along certain lines of thought, certain lines of practice, certain lines of thinking, certain lines of doing, certain lines of creating. So we have to be open to advancing in a certain area or field. If we're talking about genius, sometimes what is implied is extreme level of ability or, let's say, intelligence, extreme. And that becomes an issue of, can we handle the gift, or would it be a curse in the process? So we have to be careful what we want to open up to, because there's always a price to pay. So the same comes with, let's say, money, having too much money, having too much intelligence, having too much of anything relative to the individual can be a curse rather than a gift. So we have to be careful when we desire something like that, because you might get it. You might get it, but what is the price one is willing to pay in the process? Prayer helps, meditation helps, study helps. Knowing as much about the topic, let's say, in view, if there's a subject the person wants to be more gifted in, you have to learn as much as you can. In other words, you have to meet spirit, you have to meet this force at least halfway. You have to show that this is very important to you. You have to be very open to the possibility of actually being used by spirit, even in the unconscious, in such a way where you can start to feel that you have the ability to go deeper into a field than you ever thought you had. So that requires a little bit of resonance, a little bit of personal wish, desire, and openness, and having a creative ability, and then the karma. You need some karma to go along with it. You're not just going to get it because you asked for it. Sometimes people, because of a mishap or accident, or some kind of shock, all of a sudden move into a whole different level of consciousness and they become gifted in a certain way, but it has its drawbacks. So it is definitely possible to open oneself up, asking for it. You can pray for it, you can ask for it, you can petition for it, but there's always an exchange. There has to be a price to pay for it. Yeah. So you have to be careful. You might get what you want. Yeah. Next.
From chapter 45, you write, all circumstances of birth, as throughout life and at the time of death, exist as conditional lessons to all those relations who may be or should be concerned. Hence, births resulting in tragedy or death are a payment for all who are made or open to suffer the effects of the experience. To overindulge in such suffering is an indication that one has not learned the intended lesson of balancement through detached sorrow. My question is, what is detached sorrow? How can one learn to be detached when such strong emotions, such as sorrow, arise?
Well, we're talking now about detachment in terms of compassion. Okay. If we're talking about the death experience, there has to be a little bit of compassion for the being who passed over. So there has to be some acknowledgement that they have gone to where they need to be. Otherwise, obviously, they wouldn't be where else they are. If they're not here, they're taken out, or their time was up, or they agreed to be sort of, I guess you might say, passed. And depending on the circumstances, of course, would determine exactly the degree of grief, if there is grief, or happiness, if there is happiness. In this case, you have very sick people who want to pass, who are really completely exhausted in terms of their time here in the body, suffering as much as they suffer, and so they want to go. And then there's a relief that they go. So there's sorrow mixed with a certain amount of relief or detachment. They have to go. So there's a time to go. There's a time to stay. There's a time to fight for life. There's a time to let go of life and let others enjoy their lives and stop being a burden upon, let's say, the living. See, so all of these things pass through the minds of many who are in a position to cause suffering to others. And so there has to be, let's say, mutual compassion. Those who want to leave because they're causing their families to suffer unnecessarily and to an extreme degree for a long period of time, their hearts are in a good place when they say, yes, I want this over, because I see all of you are suffering more than I am, in a sense, and it's time for me to go, and I know it's time for me to go. So we're talking about compassionate detachment and sorrow, but it's a sorrow that has a time. So there's a time to sorrow, then there's a time to get over the sorrow. Otherwise, that could have consequences psychically, emotionally, and physically in certain people who can't let go of loss. So loss itself kills them.
So would you advocate like in that case where someone is sick and being a burden to their family, would you advocate assisted suicide?
Under circumstances, certain circumstances, that might be the way they have to go. It might be the way that is best for them to go. I'm not saying I advocate it, but I see how that could be of use to certain peeps because they know better than anybody else that they're done with their purpose in life. They're done with it. When you consider, let's say, masters, for instance, teachers and gurus, sometimes they're in a position where they say, yes, I'm going to go on this day. And so we can say, well, they're taking their life. Is this unassisted conscious suicide? Yeah. They're going to leave. Jesus said he had 3 days. He was going to be killed and then he was going to come back and then disappear. So it really depends. So death is not death. And so I think that's the first thing to get straight. If we're going to be talking about the ways of the spirits, death is not death, it's a passing. It's not bad, but it is a loss. But it's also a relief and it's also an uplift for some and maybe a payment for others, and we have to understand that. When push comes to shove and we're talking about someone who is under very, very extreme circumstances, being, let's say, physically tortured, there has to be some mercy involved. There has to be some sympathetic resonance and some compassion. So it's easy to say yes or no, but we have to use our heart, not just, reason and cold calculation. We have to use the heart. See? So when a very, very dear one grabs you by the hand and says, please let me go, I'm ready, this is too much for everybody. I mean, what do? Do you tell them no? You tell them, no, it's not your time, you haven't suffered enough yet. I know you're crying and I know you've been doing this for years, but obviously you're still alive, so hang in there until your body spits you out. See? There's no mercy here. There's no compassion beyond the point. So this is something that be given very, very deep consideration between the parties and where it has to begin or end for a specific case rather than a law particularly. That rules absolutely that you can't go one way or another, but yet everybody's dying in every way, and no one's paying specific attention to these kinds of accidental deaths and all kinds of other situations that are warranting a certain close analysis by the authorities as well, and the spiritual leaders as well. So we can say, well, under these conditions, well, certain people pass over need to be treated a certain way. They didn't just die, they died a certain way. So, there has to be more consideration given for the, let's say, the condition and karma of the death and the dying. So then death is not death, and dying is not just dying. There's some kind of machinery that, is something to sort of assume that, well, it's already taken care of, or there's nothing we can do. No, there may be a lot of things that need to be said that are not ordinarily said because, people are so, content with their ignorance relating to dying and the death process.
Also from chapter 45, you write, all spirit souls come and go according to law and not according to mortal or cosmic whim and chance. Thus, there are neither accidents nor miracles. These experiences or conditions, which may be called accidents or miracles, are simply logical results of perceivable, knowable, and thus psychophysical, apparent, gross, or even imperceptible, unknowable, and thus psychically subtle sequences of events. All things arise and set in their proper time. My question is, are you saying that it's impossible for someone to die before their time?
That's a good question. What is their time? I think that's really the special question. What is their time? Because people can die before their body dies. They can leave this earth plane way before. Sometimes they're in a coma for months or even years and gone. And the body's still sort of being kept alive, sustained. And so the question of the time of death or the time of departure is a good question. Sometimes it's obvious. People leave, they seem to leave when they leave. But in other cases it's really difficult to say. And furthermore, there may be a time when your body dies, but there may be subsequent deaths or cessations beyond what appears. So it's easy to say, oh, it's all done, it's over and done with. See? And there's nothing else to say about it when a person's, let's say, heartbeat stops or the brain goes dead. I believe that there are cases already where even in the case of the brain dead, they come back in. So the question of when is dead, and when is someone finished with the body is still a big question. See, we're looking for physical results and physical karmic indications scientifically, but who's to say that that's it? We don't know. There is too much that is questionable and maybe not really scientific when it comes to dealing with, let's say, pulling the plug. So that's an area which we have a lot of assumption and often a lot of guilt, and perhaps understandably so, because do you really know that the person really wants the plug pulled or not? Sometimes people would say, well, they signed for it, they have an agreement that they wrote before, but sometimes you have to question that. It really depends on the vibrations and what's going on around that time to make a more psychically correct estimation of whether or not the person is actually, even though they said they wanted to go when certain condition arose, right? It still has to be seen and weighed more carefully than that for many of the situations that show up. See? Yeah. And we're talking about the problem with understanding what's going on in the astral body, see, not in the physical body, because the physical body is usually all people use to determine what the signs are of living and death to begin with, but without knowing what the being itself is doing, going through, or communicating. See? So we're saying that these are really good questions, that we need more, let's say, collaboration between, let's say, the spiritualist and then the doctors and people who are more perceptive of more subtle things that are going on around the death time, if that's something that could be arranged and be tolerated by ordinary peeps. Because we're talking about death and we're talking then about spirit and spiritual experience and spirit leaving the body and functioning in such a way that most people are completely oblivious of, and I think it does warrant a little bit closer attention for peeps and more conversation before the passing occurs, just to see exactly how the person feels and what they feel concerning, let's say, the fact that they may leave the body, they may die, but they may still be around. What do you do then? See, do you want to keep them? So these are things to be talked about. Do you want to help them to go deeper, to more or less cross over into something more completely or not? These are issues for, let's say, those who are interested in let's say, making the death a more complete process. Okay.
From chapter 45, you write, incarnate families and karmas of familial attachment are real insofar as the physical level of reality is concerned. Hence, incarnate families only appear to be the total reality or truth of such relations, whereas the physical plane in terms of relations is a mere end result or mere focal point for understanding, intuiting, psychically recognizing, or spiritually knowing who or what these familiar relations were prior to their recent or present incarnation. Hence, many brothers and sisters may have been former life lovers, husbands, wives, or enemies. The same applies to children and parents. My question is, would this explain why sexual or physical abuse may be prevalent in some families? And if so, is the victim in such circumstances paying for some sort of past life karmic debt or wrongdoing that they committed against their abuser in a former lifetime?
All of these are possibilities. We can speculate. But we can also look a little bit closer at the paradox of relations. Right? You see in the blood you have the best of relations and you have the worst of relations. And you see outside of the blood you have the best of relations and the worst of relations. So then the question is, who's who and who's feeling what? See, it's, it's the timing of the dropping of the book. Yes, who's who? Are we relatives? Are we friends? Are we enemies? Are we all together? A little bit of each. It really depends on how closely we're paying attention to the psychic fields between us. There are obvious enemies in siblings, obviously, because you have siblings killing siblings. You have children killing parents. We have parents killing children. We have these very, very bizarre arrangements. Who's paying what debt from what lifetime? See? And many times when you ask these people who commit these heinous crimes, what happened? They say, I didn't do it. I don't know what happened. I was overwhelmed by something. Of course, in the court of law, that doesn't hold any weight whatsoever, but that could be the fact. Psychically examined and spiritually sort of looked into, that could have been the fact for the person. But they still have to pay the price because, you're responsible for what comes through you. Your actions, your thoughts are yours. That is to say, whatever's coming through you belongs to you, goes back to source. So there's a lot to be seen. I think the conversation should be opened more psychologically in terms of discerning, well, what kind of relationship do you really have with your sibling? Is it really benign? Is it really sweet? Is it really conflictive? Is it a struggle? Do you sometimes, maybe more than not, act and feel like enemies? Is that the nature of the relationship between you and one or the other parent, or both parents, or uncles? These are very important questions that have to be recognized and dealt with very, very straight up, straight to the point, so that we can then start to reverse the reaction between such beings and begin to neutralize whatever the karmas are so that they don't lead to mishaps, catastrophes, and further complications in the bloodline.
From chapter 45, you write, thine enemies are stronger in blood. The taking and giving or sparing of blood in past lives makes for a blood relative at some time or other. My question is this always the case? Are there ever exceptions to this rule? And what about in the case of, say, for example, warfare, where it may not necessarily be personal, or say, what about when it's due to an accident where it wasn't the intentions of the person responsible for the bloodshed?
Well, killing, justifiable killing, as in the case of warfare, when you have, say, police doing their job, there's always a sting involved. And it's not easy to take a person's life because we're all humans, we're parents, we're brothers, we're sisters, we're children. And so there's always a sting. And you hear that from the lips of these individuals who are in service to the public, as public servants, where they don't really want to have to shoot somebody's kid, but they're put in a very, very difficult position because the kid has a gun, because the kid is a perpetrator or whatever. it's hard to see that. It's hard to really purge yourself from that. So these kinds of circumstances are very difficult just by nature on the surface. When we're talking about warfare, then it would seem to be less personal, but it isn't. And it's certainly not personal up at close range when you see the person who you know is firing back at you. And they have no choice because that's their job. And yet they still may have a heart. And then when you have eye-to-eye contact with a fellow combatant, you know, on the other side, an enemy, there could be some kind of moment of deep inner conscience, and let's say even to a degree of shock as to what love is, and why are people really killing themselves? Why does war show up as it does at all? And what has failed for people have to be in these, let's say, blood wars or wars of blood, race and nationality? These are very mystifying and perplexing questions that have to do with the heart. Say, do we have to? Say. Now, there's a level of consciousness that we can say in terms of spiritual practice and spiritual progression that has to do with all beings being related, all beings being one at the heart level. Now, that's very abstract, but it's certainly true in the case of someone like Jesus. And in other masters who have come in and said, no, we have to love one another. See, we have to love our enemies. And that's difficult for a lot of materialistic and undeveloped people to even think about, let alone sort of conduct themselves along the lines of, let's say, a Christian principle like that. Right? Love those who do you harm. So we're talking about purifying the heart when the blood, because it affects you in the blood. When we're talking about the enemies are stronger in blood, we're not just talking about family, because that's very powerful. You know, when we're talking about family enemies, and taking or giving of life is also like building karma in the blood, and I think that's what we were talking about. Are you bound to these peeps? Yes, in memory you are bound. Do you have nightmares, which a lot of police speak about, and they have to go and see psychiatrists about, and sometimes they commit suicide over it. It's just too much that it plagues them. There's too much that comes back to even the military people who are suffering from various issues relative to combat, and what they see being played back in their minds of kids being destroyed. It destroys them, even if it's impersonal, and it's just like machinery, where you're shooting bullets, and then you have to go to the area that you just shot at because your troops are moving through it, and you got to secure it. That has a devastating effect upon many of the soldiers, men and women. So it's a really tough topic to deal with. So we do pay for it indirectly. So you take it with you. You actually do take it with you. Yes. Comment. Yeah. Question.
From chapter 46, you write, being free of inappropriate, unnecessary, or unconscious ancestral worship, one clears the way for spiritual progress here and now. My question is, what would be considered inappropriate or unnecessary ancestral worship? Could you give some examples?
Well, we have many examples. There is appropriate ancestral worship. I mean, in music you see that. You see that in the arts. You see that in let's say, very, very positive occupations. In terms of public and world service, we see that. So there's respecting ancestry in terms of your lineage, and your family line of professionals or what have you. And then there's the darker side of that, inappropriate. In other words, there's a side of it that says, let your ancestors be at peace too. Don't keep dragging them don't keep blaming them for what is happening or not happening in your case, because you're there as an extension of your ancestral line to improve your lot. You have to take responsibility for yourself. And so we do see that often in certain family cases in terms of, we had wealth before, we don't have wealth, whose fault was it? You have these issues in families. Well, so-and-so caused this to happen. So we're talking about holding the ancestors in a negative way responsible for you know, what one doesn't have in the present because it may have been there before and so on. So we're talking now about materialism. And so there's an appropriate, I guess you might say, resonation with the ancestors as if it is their fault. And maybe in some ways it may be, but what it is in terms of the individual's responsibility to living to do is to reconcile these issues where there's conflict relative to ancestral karma. And it is also true that the certain ancestors still influence the family in certain ways. Maybe there may be some uncertain ways. But they show up. Some of them will show up in dreams and guide the family or misguide the family. So we're talking about paying attention to dreams and psychic experience to determine what of the ancestors is being used for better and or for worse relative to holding the family back or advancing the purpose of the family and the level of the family to a higher place. So this, again, has to do less with a theory about it and more with exactly how the ancestors are being held up for better and for worse in every family's case.
I have one final question. It's from, you write in chapter 47, all ties remain to be purified, blood binds, kill animals and one binds oneself to them and the intensity of their death experience. Eat animals and one chemically partakes of their genes, their bloodshedding, their suffering, and their death. My question is, what kind of an effect other than the obvious physical one can eating animals have on an individual? Can it affect the individual on these psychic or astral planes? Could it cause psychic disturbances and or nightmares to occur?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, animals are friends. They're beings. See? They are spirits. See? And you know, the question is, do they have souls? Well, they have awareness, so they have soul, so to speak. They may not have an ego in a manner of speaking, but often, if you know certain animals, they have about as much character and self, let's say, responses. That is to say, they seem very personally involved with their masters or with their families, and so we're talking about sympathetic resonance, respect. They can defend you, they can protect you, and we're talking about domesticated animals. They're protectors. They're psychically aligned for first defense. See? So when they start meowing at unseen influences, they're warning you that something's there. When they start barking and you can't see what they're barking at or who they're barking at, then we're talking about, yes, that's your line of defense right there. Are they worthy of being protected? Yes, absolutely. Because if they go down, you have no protection, you have no warning system. So often you have the animals or pets that are actually there as the first line of defense. They're doing their job, see, because of sensitivity. So then the issue relative to what the effects are of killing and blood, well, yes, we're talking about the person's sensitivity. We're talking about exchanging DNA. We're exchanging energy at the atomic level. So that means you have some of that energy in you, women taking on the energy of the men, men taking on the energy of the women. All of this is part of the sharing of, let's say, genes, sharing of fluids. And so karma is exchanged. And between people, no doubt. And thus between species, no doubt, right? We're breathing in the air that's good and bad, toxic waste. So we're getting it from all angles and our bodies are processing it. Some of it is good, some of it is not good. There are plagues out there. When they get to you, they're going to knock you down and they're going to upset a lot of peeps. A lot of flus and diseases that are out there, they're going to knock you out. Because your body, while your body is ingesting that and dealing with it, and people are sharing it on aircrafts, on air flights, and in boats and everywhere else, some bodies can't handle it. So we're talking about sensitivity and resistance to these things, but we're also talking about memories. It's hard to get some of these things that happen out of your memories.
What about, like in certain native cultures where they say respect or honor the animal's spirit before they kill it, sacrifice it?
The spirits of animals can appear to you, and which is maybe very bizarre, but the spirits of animals can be inhabited by other higher spirits. Okay? remember, the example given in the Bible is Jesus, and I think it was relative to pigs that were possessed by demons. And he said, be gone, you demons, right? You evil spirits, be gone. This is a classic example of demons, darker, lower spirits possessing animals. And so I think that says a lot to our cause here in terms of the spirits and who is influenced by spirits and who channels spirits. And we see just about anything can channel a spirit. Thank you.
Thank you.